Nick Delius here, along with the month of November, by the way. And thanks for joining this week's Far Middle for episode 76. We're going to go with a joint dedication this week that gives a dual nod to the year 1976 for episode 76. Two sports achievements of substantial note in that bicentennial year. So we start in the world of collegiate football. There's a guy from Hopewell High School in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania, which is less than 30 minutes from where I'm sitting. His name is Anthony Dorsett. Johnny Majors recruited him to play down the road at Pitt. At the University of Pittsburgh, Tony Dorsett became the first freshman in almost 30 years in the NCAA to be named All-American. The last guy that did that was sort of around World War II in 1944, Doc Blanchard at Army. Dorsett's 1,500 plus rushing yards at the time was the most ever recorded by a freshman. And by the way, he broke the record with that sort of mark as a freshman by a person who played at New Mexico State, and his name was Ron Poe James. He did it in 1968. But here's a weird factoid. Poe James, like Tony Dorsett, hailed from Beaver County, Pennsylvania. So they sort of came from the same little corner or neck of the western Pennsylvania woods that one breaking the record of the other. Pretty cool. Now, another detail about Tony Dorsett, he originally went by Anthony, as I mentioned, but the school's athletic department at Pitt convinced him to go by Tony, so then his initials would become TD, as in touchdown. It reminds me of when Joe, at the time Theismann, changed his pronunciation to Theismann to rhyme with Heisman. So 3 games into his sophomore season, Dorsett became Pitt's all-time leader in career rushing yards just a few games into his second year. Mind you, not like his senior year, a few games into his sophomore year. That's how great he was. He loved playing against Notre Dame, by the way, speaking of Joe Theismann. Against Notre Dame in Dorsett's junior year, he had over 300 yards rushing. That broke the single game rushing record for Pitt. And as a senior in 76, Dorsett had almost 300 yards against Notre Dame again. By the way, when he was a senior in 1976, Tony Dorsett did okay. He helped lead his school to a national title, which Pitt won. He picked up the Heisman Trophy. He won the Maxwell Award, the Walter Camp Award for Player of the Year, and he also won the UPI Player of the Year Award. And he led the nation in rushing with over 2,100 yards. So Dorsett finished his college career with over 6,000 total rushing yards. That was an NCAA record at the time. That would stand until the late 1990s when Ricky Williams came along and broke it. And Dorsett was the first Pitt player to have his jersey retired, rightfully so. Maybe the greatest running back in college football history, and obviously one of the greatest running backs in NFL history, where he just kept doing amazing things and is a Hall of Famer in Canton. Now, 76, that bicentennial year, also brought another sports accomplishment of extraordinary note, which speaks to the second part of our dedication for episode 76. The 1976 Summer Olympic Games, they were held in the great city of Montreal. This was the Olympics of Bruce Jenner and the decathlon. But for me, the biggest note of these games was found in boxing. 5 American boxers. You got Sugar Ray Leonard, who we all know. You got the Spinks brothers, Leon Spinks and Michael Spinks. You got Leo Randolph and Howard Davis Jr. All of them won gold medals in boxing. It's been often called the greatest Olympic boxing team that the United States ever had. And out of the 5 American gold medalists in boxing, all but one of them, all but Davis, went on to become professional world champions. So they did really well after the Olympics too. And Randolph, by the way, of the 5 who became a professional world champion, he holds the record for the shortest career as a world champion, which is another little factoid for you. So you won't see an Olympic boxing team that was as stacked or as accomplished as this one was again. And it's sad to see the state of boxing today in such a diminished light compared to its heyday in the 70s and early 80s. As you know, I'm a big boxing fan, and that 76 Olympic team really set themselves up for the golden era of a lot of boxing there in the later 70s, early 80s. So dual dedication for 76 goes to the year 1976 and an unprecedented collegiate football capstone senior year for Tony Dorsett and a U.S. boxing team at Montreal that brought home 5 gold medals, a team for the ages. All right, let's be off and running on connecting those dots. So Dorsett accumulated rushing yards at an astonishing pace the moment he showed up on campus. Unfortunately, there is something else that is accumulating at an even more astonishing rate these days than Dorsett's rushing yards, and that is our national debt. It's exceeded 31 trillion this fall, which is now placing it at 125% of GDP. That's a level we haven't seen since World War II. Now, when your debt runs up to these levels, 31 trillion bucks, it creates all kinds of other problems and challenging symptoms. It's sort of the law of large numbers. Even a small number times 31 trillion, that's going to lead to a big product in that multiplication exercise. And you add to the law of large numbers the fact that interest rates are being raised by the Fed as we speak, and you end up with some pretty sobering realities when it comes to the cost of paying the interest on all of that debt. Our interest tab on the national debt, it's running at about $90 billion a month. That's a month, not a year. And that works out, of course, to over $1 trillion a year in interest expense that we have to pay on the $31 trillion in principal. That's just the carrying cost. And as the Fed continues to raise rates to try to tame inflation, that $90 billion a month and $1 trillion bucks a year in interest costs, they're only going to go up and increase. And by the way, as the $31 trillion continues to grow, as each and every year the federal government spends more than it takes in, running a deficit, the same sort of dynamic is going to happen. And when both interest rates are going up and deficits are adding to the national debt amount or principal, then you have the double whammy where interest costs accelerate even more. Lucky us, we are living in just such a double whammy world. Now, here's another way to put the $1 trillion in gross interest expense in perspective. That is about what is paid out in Social Security each year. And Social Security is the single largest expenditure item in the federal budget. So, in other words, it's easy to see and to expect that the interest cost of our bloated national debt will sort of exceed or supersede Social Security to the point where it becomes the biggest expenditure in the entire federal budget. That will happen soon, but maybe I need to caveat that prediction of it happening soon because Social Security outflows are also expanding rapidly due to cost of living adjustments in our new higher inflation world. So the more accurate view is that we now have a race between Social Security expenditures and interest expense on a growing debt load as to which one is going to hold the crown for the largest line item in the federal budget. And there's always that argument that you hear from the Keynesians and the left and the MMT fans that says as long as the economy is growing enough, the debt load doesn't matter. Well, there's no longer something we need to be debating with respect to this anymore because if you run the math, we would need over 3% GDP growth per year to cover the net interest expense on the publicly held government debt. Today, of course, we're shrinking GDP, not growing it, let alone growing it at over a 3% clip rate. So we're not outrunning the debt monster. It is gaining on us, if you want to use sort of a nightmare analogy. And there are some other intriguing pieces of the national financial health when you take a closer look. One of them I wanted to discuss is national debt per citizen versus the national debt per taxpayer. There's a big difference on how that works out for the $31 trillion in debt load. On a per citizen or on a per person basis, it works out to about $93,000 per citizen. But on a per taxpayer basis, the math comes out to $246,000 of debt per taxpayer, which, even for those with basic math skills like myself, it tells us there are over 2.5 times as many citizens as taxpayers, or said differently, only 3 or 4 out of every 10 citizens are a taxpayer. That presents its own math problems with less and less of the population paying tax revenues into the system, and the system is leaking deficits every year and growing the debt burden, and something, of course, has to give as the entire structure starts to groan under the weight and the pressure. So that's fascinating. It's scary at the same time. I wanted to discuss it with you constant listeners. And I mentioned inflation making the debt situation even more challenging. Well, our next topic discusses a part of the inflation crisis, which is food price inflation. Grocery prices are way up. Everyone in a nation and across the globe knows it and feels it. The United Nations is calling 2022 a year of unprecedented hunger. That's the same United Nations, by the way, that also tagged climate change as code red for humanity. Now, I bring those two UN proclamations together because one impacts and creates the other. You see, the UN lectures and demands the world stop using natural gas because of code red and the myth that things like wind and solar are zero carbon. Well, when you run from reliable energy like natural gas and you pin all your hopes exclusively on things like wind and solar, energy supply becomes scarce and costs become high. What does that do? Those things stoke not just energy inflation, but inflation across all segments of the economy, including food, because growing food requires fertilizer, and making fertilizer requires natural gas as the major feedstock. 70% of the cost of nitrogen-based fertilizers is for natural gas. So you decrease the supply of natural gas and increase its costs, the cost of fertilizer goes up with it, and then the cost of growing food goes up. Growers use less fertilizer due to its costs. That hurts crop yields, creating more food scarcity and even higher food costs. And growers may use less fertilizer for crops because it simply isn't available anymore. About 3/4 of Europe's fertilizer production capacity is offline due to high energy costs. So there's a fertilizer availability problem as well. Today, 50 million people on the planet teeter on the verge of famine. 50 million. And over 800 million go to sleep each night hungry. And the cost of food keeps going up, and the availability of food is declining. Why? Because in large part of this ideology that worships future climate and false fixes over the human condition today. So, you might ask, what are governments doing about the mess they created when it comes to things like climate and energy policies? Well, that brings us to our next topic, at least in the case of Germany. You see, Germany's government is panicking, as it should be, by the way, over the cost of energy and the knock-on impacts of that energy inflation. So instead of stopping and reversing course on the damaging energy policies that caused the crisis, the government in Germany now instead wants to impose price controls and caps on the economy for energy. The panic the government feels, of course, is due to a lot of legitimate concerns. There's consumer confidence that's plummeting, business investment is evaporating, the private economy and sector, they're shutting down under the weight of energy policies, and exports, of course, which has always been the German economy's lifeblood, they're shrinking. And I read this recently, more than half of small and mid-sized businesses in Germany, they worry that energy costs could put them under or out of business. That's over half of those businesses. Just unbelievable. And many are out there warning that insolvencies in business are going to start to swell into effectively a tidal wave. So the economy minister in Germany recently had an interesting sort of thought. The economy minister said, quote, "The energy crisis that we have is threatening to grow into an economic and social crisis," end quote. Hey, too late, economy minister. Your energy policies created the energy crisis, and the energy crisis now has already created an economic and social crisis that hasn't been seen, frankly, in generations. Now, what you see in Germany is a certain dynamic at play that we're seeing more and more of across the globe with governments. You've got the state causing a problem with one move or one policy, and then treating the symptoms that it causes by more state intervention. In Germany, it was energy and climate policies causing economic hardship and inflation, which the state used to justify now price caps on energy. Let's connect that to what's going on across the English Channel from Europe in the UK. About a month ago, the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister in the UK, Boris Johnson's successor, she rolled out some modest loosening of taxes on incomes and corporations. Basically letting doers and value creators in the UK keep more of their stuff. Well, therein, of course, lies the problem. Less government, less state is going to be attacked these days from all directions. The Prime Minister puts the plan out and is promptly attacked. Our president, by the way, took a shot at the UK Prime Minister via Twitter. Nice look, Joe, sort of channeling your predecessor more and more these days, it seems. And then you had the IMF, which is supposed to be focused on financially strapped nations and helping them. The IMF took a shot at the Prime Minister. And of course, the media, including the financial media, took their shots as well, and so on. Now, what's striking is the level of what the Prime Minister had proposed. It would have taken tax policy back to what it was in 2021. These weren't drastic moves or drastic actions. But you see, any rollback of the state and government, that's going to be attacked by government and its allies everywhere, not just in the UK in this instance. Our president sees what the UK is doing with tax reform and worries it impacts what he can do here with wealth appropriation. Same with the IMF and its grand plans and the media and its left leanings. You have to question whether any substantive reform is ever going to be achievable again in a Western economy. The UK recent episode says that it's highly unlikely to be able to get substantive reform moving. And by the way, a mini dot to connect to this UK tax reform drama. As I said, our president attacked the prime minister on Twitter because he says it results in basically income inequality and it favors the well-to-do, this type of tax reform. That's the same president, by the way, who basically has shoved electric vehicle mandates down our throats in this nation that grant tax subsidy to multi-billion-dollar corporations and affluent consumers who can afford to buy $100,000-ish electric vehicles. Just a little bit hypocritical, don't you think? I thought that was interesting. Now, speaking of electric vehicle subsidy and those being part of climate policies and world organizations like the IMF, let's talk about climate change and the World Bank as our next connection. Late September or early October, I can't exactly recall when, you had the head of the World Bank who came under intense fire. Now, why did he come under intense fire? Well, he was asked at a New York climate event about his views on fossil fuels causing rapid global warming or something like that. And his answer was succinct when he stated, quote, "I am not a scientist," end quote. Well, look out, Loretta. You can't be head of a global entity like the World Bank, be in New York City, and be at a climate conference, which is code for a religious revival these days, and answer questions with logic like that. He should know better. He should have denounced fossil fuels. He should have screamed code red. He should have led the audience in some sort of profession of faith. Don't use rational thought to answer a complicated question that's not in your arena of expertise. The science is settled. Didn't you know that? So after this sort of Q&A session at the conference, Al Gore himself called the head of the World Bank a climate denier. Our climate czar, Czar Kerry, he criticized the head of the World Bank as well. And by the way, both Gore and Kerry were rumored to be interested in this individual's job as head of the World Bank. You can't make this stuff up, constant listeners. That's why I bring it to you every week. Yes, be careful, for goodness sake, when you're speaking in public about science these days. Stick to the consensus. Say the science is settled, whatever the topic. Follow the science. Stay in the herd. And when herd shifts direction, then be sure to shift with it. And the herd of experts and elite today, they've been sounding off about our next connection, which is linking climate policies and ideology to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. So the IRA was sold as a necessary fix and step to saving the planet. Proponents say the IRA will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. Wow, that sounds really impressive, except it's not all that impressive. You see, the baseline year for the greenhouse gas emission reduction it's referenced is 2005, and we are already over 50% of the way to half of the reduction in the IRA right now. Not because of government policy, of course, or because of government spending, but we got over 50% of the way there because of the private sector and domestic natural gas industry innovating and creating the shale revolution that provided natural gas to be able to displace coal and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the nation for free, without government spending, without the IRA. But hey, the IRA taking credit for what the private sector already has delivered. Why split hairs, right? And there's another little provision in the IRA that I found interesting and wanted to share with you. $60 billion, that's billion with a B, going toward environmental justice. That's twice as much dollars as the annual budget of the entire Department of Justice. Massive pork to feed the attorney complex, the academic complex, and the environmental NGO complex. Best of all, it fits perfectly with the leftist rhetoric and ideology. Now, I just mentioned the academic complex. I want to hit on a dot there for a minute. Maybe you remember this, but back in 2017, the Trump administration instituted a 1.4% levy or excise tax on university endowments. All kinds of carve-out exceptions were created, right, to avoid the tax. But when it was enacted, the academic complex threw a massive fit. They argued it would kill philanthropy, it would destroy scholarships to needy students, and basically that it was a massive attack on education. Well, now the data, albeit limited in scope and transparency, the data are starting to trickle in. And the results show the amount of tax is well below what was projected, and that the 1.4% rate, if exemptions are not met and basically it's paid, it has no impact on anything the academic complex is doing these days. Total reported taxes for 33 universities, including massively funded endowments like Princeton and Notre Dame and Stanford, multi-billion-dollar endowments, it was about $68 million for the 2018-2019 fiscal academic year. So you compare that to the, $1 trillion or so in student loan forgiveness and all the pandemic support and subsidies sent to colleges and higher education. Paying a fair share? Please. It's more like paying no share. It's another reason why the fiscal math we discussed at the start of episode 76 is so troubling and so unsustainable. This is a great example within the bigger or broader problem. And by the way, most schools refuse to disclose their payments for this excise tax. That's right, those ivory towers that lecture corporations to be transparent, and the ones clamoring for regulations to demand it on businesses. Those are the same ivory towers who refuse to be transparent with their own finances as public institutions. But if you think things at colleges are bad, let's back up to connect what's going on with public education K through 12 in places like Illinois. And you might think what you're about to hear, these data are wrong, or that I'm misstating them, or I'm confused. But I assure you they are not incorrect, and I am not confused. It's very shocking. In 2019, only 36% of Illinois third graders could read at grade level. 27% was the proficiency for reading for third graders for Hispanic students, 22% proficiency for Black student third graders. And by the way, that's statewide across all of Illinois. You start to look within certain districts, it gets even worse. In places like Decatur, 2% of Black third graders read at grade level and 1% can perform math at grade level. By the 11th grade in Decatur, 5% of students read at grade level, 4% are okay at math at grade level proficiencies. And by the way, these are pre-COVID shutdown rates. So I would expect them to get even worse today, if worse is even possible, at these abysmal rates. Now you might ask how the teachers in Illinois and in places like Decatur are evaluated with these pathetic proficiency results. Well, in Decatur, 97.3% of teachers were rated as excellent or proficient, and that was by the Illinois State Board of Education. In Chicago, 100% of teachers hit those marks of excellent or proficient, by the way. The Chicago Teachers Union, they walked out of classrooms not once, 4 times in 7 years for more money. They got more money or benefits every time they walked out, every single time. This is shameful. This, of course, unfortunately, is not exclusive to Illinois. It's happening to certain extents everywhere you look. Public unions being enriched, education proficiency being derated to secondary, if any, concern, and no one in government, no one in the media, or no one in politics giving a care about it. We're losing, or we lost, an entire generation and their potential across this nation in our public schools. But the scheme, it just continues to go on. All right, it's time to wrap up episode 76 for this week. Now, we dedicated the episode to sports world achievements, right, of note in the year 1976. And we covered a lot of topics this episode. So let's close with some of the epic albums in rock that were released in 1976 and how their titles or hit songs tie to the connections that we made this week. Let's start with the what I'll call the sonically gifted ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. They released a new world record in 1976. Great album. And that is a great connection to our new record national debt topic that we discussed. One of my guilty pleasures musically that I have to tell you about is the group ABBA. I've loved them since I was basically 12 years old. In 1976, they gave us the classic album Arrival. Arrival, this episode, reminds me of how the crises in food scarcity and food inflation and hunger have arrived, all being delivered by horrendous energy policies from governments. Stevie Wonder, the great Stevie Wonder, put out his masterpiece, Songs in the Key of Life, in 1976. I had a chance to see him perform that album in its entirety a few years ago. It was a great experience. And a hit on that epic album is I Wish. I connect that hit to how I wish Germany wouldn't follow bad energy policy with bad inflation policy with things like price caps on energy. It's only going to worsen the situation for all involved. Steely Dan issued The Royal Scam in 1976. Sounds a lot like the electric vehicle racket, doesn't it? Genesis, another favorite group of mine, they released the first album with Phil Collins on vocals after Peter Gabriel left in 1976. That album, of course, was A Trick of the Tail. Certainly reminds me and connects to the tricks government used to tout the supposed environmental benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act. And then how about Billy Joel's classic album Turnstiles that came out in 76? Reminds me of Illinois processing our next generation of students through the system's turnstiles without any care as to whether they have reading or math proficiency. I didn't realize how 1976 was such a great year for music. Let's work toward making sure those album titles no longer apply in 2022 to the extent that they unfortunately apply currently with the topics that we discuss. Let's get to work and reconvene in a week.